Bom, vou começar em português, só para avisar a todos que tem o botão do lado direito falado Interpretation. Então, vamos ter tradução simultânea aqui no evento de hoje. Por favor, cliquem. Espero que gostem do evento. É sempre uma honra estar aqui com a Isabel e com o Tom. Preparamos esse evento com muito carinho. É o nosso terceiro evento. Vou migrar aqui para inglês, para que o Tom, nosso convidado especial, possa participar. Well, welcome, Tom. Always an honor to have you with us. For those of you who don't know, Tom is the Compliance Evangelist. He is a resource guide in the compliance world, my reference to any and all questions I have regarding the FCPA and compliance trends. I always enjoy having these breakfasts because they're a learning opportunity for me. Since he's based in the US and follows these trends closely, it's an opportunity for me and for all of you to ask questions to him. Please feel free to ask questions throughout the event. There's the chat box in the bottom of the screen. Isabel and I will select questions and ask them to Tom. And the idea is really for this event to be as interactive as possible. And with that,
please identify yourself and say your name, full name, and the company or firm or consulting.
Excellent. Well, with that, I was going to pass on to you, Isabel, for some housekeeping rules.
Okay, my housekeeping rules. First of all, I'm very sad to announce that unfortunately, our dear friend and client, Rogéria Gedemecki, the Chief Compliance Officer of LATAM Airlines, was scheduled to be here, but she went to Chile on a business trip. And just before boarding on the plane, she tested positive for COVID. So she was held in Chile, and Chile has an interesting system. They put her in, I think it's a clinic. She'll definitely tell the story when she's able to join us, if not today, some other event, because certainly she will be here with us. So she's not able to attend today. Maybe knowing Rogéria, because she performs miracles, maybe later on she'll be here with us. But anyway, the format is always dear Cynthia and I, and a special female guest, almost like Charlie's Angels, Tom Fox Angels, speak with him in a very informal way. Tom, as you know, is absolutely I know he calls him the evangelist, but he's really the person I know who is most current with everything. So it's an honor for us to have him here, giving us the latest news about FCPA enforcement compliance in the world of representatives. Love to speak with him. He's going to talk about his books, but he's been here before and will be here in person in October, because we're going to put together an event with the big organization. So he'll come here to spend time with us, and then also give us a course at Azevedo Sette. We'll put a whole course together. Now, housekeeping also would be, the book at the end of the event. Tatiana, our organized raffle a book to those who are still in attendance. I think that's it. Did I leave anything else? Yes, our roundtable will be the one that Azevedo Sette has every month, the second Tuesday of the month. It will be on April the 12th. And also on the same format of this Breakfast with Tom Fox, the male friends, our friends, were complaining that we only have women here asking Tom questions. So we decided to have the same format with Professor Carol Bastry. For those of you who took one of her courses here in Brazil, she loves Brazil, she loves the Brazilian. So we will have the same format with men. So the next event will be Tea with Professor Carol. It will be April 27th at 5 o'clock. Tatiana will, of course, send all of the invitations. And our special guest will be João Elecki. That requires no introduction, but you will see him there. So going on, I spoke too much. Thank you all for being here. We had more than 130 people enrolled, and we always have to give them a little more time. But without further ado, dear Tom, please take the floor.
Isabel, thank you. It's always great to be back with the Breakfast Roundtable in Brazil. There's been a couple of different things developed, obviously, since we last got together. The war in Ukraine is the biggest. I'll have a couple of remarks about that. But I wanted to spend time, start with a few remarks about a white paper I've submitted to Isabel to submit to you all, which is the intersection of tax and compliance. Most of us, certainly when I was in the Chief Compliance Officer's chair, I did not think about tax, and I didn't think about its intersection with compliance, but it turns out there's lots of intersections. And I lay those out in the paper, and the most important, or rather probably the most obvious, would be, how do you sell? Do you sell through sales agents? Do you sell through distributors? There's tax implications for each one of those, and your tax experts can help you with those. And so if you've never done so, if you're back in the office, I would ask you to go down and have a cup of coffee or tea with your tax counsel. And if you're not back in the office, perhaps have a Zoom meeting with them. They'll be thrilled to talk to you. But I want to spend most of my time talking about a significant speech given in October by Lisa Monaco. Lisa Monaco is the Deputy Attorney General in the United States. That's the #2 position. In a corporation, she would be the COO, the Chief Operating Officer. And that position, the Deputy Attorney General, which we call in the United States the DAG, the DAG. The DAG is the person who makes policy announcements. And she made some major policy announcements around compliance. In her opening remarks, Cynthia talked about FCPA and compliance. Cynthia, I think we're going to have to move to just talking about compliance. I think as much as the FCPA may have led the world, I think those days are over. And I think now, with the robust nature of compliance laws in Brazil, in the United Kingdom, in China, in the Middle East, literally across the world, I think we're going to start talking about compliance and not the FCPA. Each country, of course, will have their own eccentricities, but I think we'll move towards really some key points around compliance. So I really want to talk to you about compliance, not specifically the FCPA, because what Lisa Monaco said, or we would call her in America DAG Monaco, it's not a term of derisement, it's a term of respect. The DAG, she talked about individual accountability, and the U.S. Department of Justice wants you as chief compliance officers or people who are either leading or overseeing internal investigations now to turn over all information about any individual who may have been involved in a violation. That was the original policy of the Department of Justice in 2015 in a document called the Yates Memo. At that time, Sally Yates was the Deputy Attorney General, or the DAG. That got changed during the Trump years. And now we're back to, you have to turn over all information about individuals who may have been involved. And the Department of Justice will then determine who they want to prosecute going forward. Now, that's has a couple of significant implications, particularly around your internal investigations. And this is where people like Isabel and perhaps Cynthia will really have to think through some of these implications. And it's the following. If your investigation turns up information and you turn that information over to the Department of Justice, as you have to, all of that information is now discoverable by the other side. So in the United States, if the Department of Justice then prosecuted individuals, your internal investigation would be turned over. But more than simply your internal investigation, all of your investigative documents, your interview notes, your transcripts, any documents that you've uncovered. So for people like Isabel, for people like Cynthia, for people who are outside, who are doing investigations, you need to think about what happens not when the Department of Justice, not when the regulator gets my documents, because they will get my documents, but what happens when the other side gets my documents? It means that if you do an investigation, you need to have a process, a protocol, a work plan, and follow that work plan. It's not going to keep you from doing anything different. It just means that you need to document with rigor what you've done in your investigation. Why did you interview Mr. Smith and you didn't interview Mrs. Jones, for instance? If you write that down, that will be discoverable. So that has an important implications really for everyone on this call, whether you're in-house legal, whether you're in-house compliance, or whether you're outside counsel or an outside consultant. So individual accountability. That leads to point number 2. And this one is, it's not new. Let me start that over. It is new, but it's not something that's going to be new to you as a compliance professional. And that's corporate culture. We all recognize that culture, it all starts with culture. And you have to have a culture that respects compliance and ethics and then implements it in your business. Well, for the first time, we had the Department of Justice saying, not only is culture important, which is something that we all understand, but we as a Department of Justice will now assess your culture. And that's new. So I would ask everyone on this call to think about, have we looked at our culture? Have we assessed our culture? If we have found our culture not sufficient, have we then worked to improve our culture? That's going to be extremely important for this next point. If you or your company was in an FCPA investigation and you moved to settle that, whether it be all the way from a deferred prosecution agreement, perhaps you took a criminal plea, all the way down to a declination. The Department of Justice only looked at prior violations of the FCPA. Now, in this speech from Lisa Monaco, she said, we're going to look at your company's entire conduct, your entire culture. And this means every type of law and regulation you can imagine. So trade sanctions, environmental, human rights, diversity, sexual harassment, any law you can imagine, and we can imagine them all because that's what we do. The Department of Justice wants to look at your conduct in those areas. If you've been involved in prior litigation, if you've been involved in prior regulatory investigations, if you've had other fines and penalties. So I come out of the energy industry. Obviously, environmental is a very big part of the energy industry. In my company, when I was there, we were constantly under investigation. Environmental, antitrust, or anti-competitive, and a variety of others. That was just the way business was done. Well, now the Department of Justice is going to look at all of that other conduct. So that ties into your corporate culture. And you, as the compliance officer, now need to consider all of the conduct of your company if you're in front of the Department of Justice. So that is a pretty big change. And I will say there has been pushback by companies on that, but the Department of Justice has said, no, we're going to look at all of your culture across the board. And it's not just if you're a US company in the United States. It's not just if you're a Brazilian company in Brazil. We're going to look at your conduct across the globe. So that's a pretty big change. Also, a very big change was in the area of monitors and monitorships. Under the Trump administration, there were very few monitors, and So the Department of Justice cut back on that through something called the Benczkowski Memo, named for Brian Benczkowski. That has been revoked. And there's now a new monitorship policy in place, and the Department of Justice will be much more aggressive in utilizing monitors going forward. Now, I've been under a monitorship. I know many of you on this call have been under monitorships, or you know people who've been under monitorships, and you know they can be challenging times. But the Department of Justice, understanding the concerns we in the compliance community have, in the legal community, literally across the world for monitors, have tried to make it a little more palatable. And they've tried to make it palatable in the following ways. Number one, the reason the department wants to use monitorships because it extends their ability to look into a company and see, is the company really following their settlement agreement, whether that's a deferred prosecution agreement, non-prosecution agreement, or other. Number two, that if there is other conduct going on, and what I'm about to say is all public record, so I'm not giving away any information. There's a very big monitorship of the Swedish company, telecom company, Ericsson. And they paid over a $1 billion fine. Well, a year after, or 2 years after the monitor or the deferred prosecution agreement began, Ericsson disclosed that they had an entirely different set of FCPA violations they had never reported. Some occurred prior to signing the DPA, some occurred after. So that's in compliance terms, that's very not good. That's very bad. But because the monitor was in place, it was discovered. And however bad it may be for Ericsson, it's not going to be as bad as if it was something found later. So that's number two. But number three, and here's where I would ask you to perhaps reconsider your own personal views of monitorships. The Department of Justice has said that a monitor can be used to help you as a compliance officer put in place a truly global best practices compliance program. And this really goes back to what I said to you, Cynthia. It's not an FCPA compliance program. It's a global program. And it takes into account where you're doing business and the differences in the Clean Companies Act and the FCPA or the UK Bribery Act or French Sapon-Tout or any of the other laws that we now have to follow around anti-corruption and anti-bribery, so that perhaps we all can use the monitor in a more proactive manner and a more collaborative manner. So when my company had a monitor, all you could do was present something to the monitor and they would say yes or no, no guidance. Well, now the monitor is specifically charged with giving compliance officers and companies guidance. So hopefully that will help people like us, the compliance professionals who have to deal with monitors, and perhaps it can be a very valuable resource to you going forward. So those are really the key parts of the Monaco speech. There's one other part that I think ties to the Monaco speech, but it only came out this past week. I'm not sure how I feel about it, but it's something that we all are going to need to think about. And it's the following. Someone below Lisa Monaco at the Department of Justice, a gentleman named Kenneth Polite, gave a talk, not a formal speech, and he said the following. The Department of Justice was considering having, when a company settles FCPA violation, whether it's DPA, NPA, or other, when they complete their term of settlement, that the chief compliance officer and the CEO will have to certify compliance with the DPA. Now, that means that you, Mr. or Ms. or Mrs. Compliance Officer or Chief Compliance Officer, would have to put your name on a document. And that could be very risky. It could be very high profile. It would also mean you're now co-equal with your CEO. How's the CEO going to feel about that? How's the general counsel going to feel about that? How about the board of directors? Because it's ultimately the board's responsibility. Now, those remarks were made perhaps not as a formal speech, so I can't tell you that's going to be implemented. But if you tie that back to the Monaco speech, you see where the Department of Justice is most concerned about companies who engage in recidivist behavior, meaning they have a second violation after the first, like Ericsson, or that there was conduct which was not reported, which led to the original settlement, once again, like Ericsson. And so I think the Department of Justice is most concerned about those. All of the Monaco speech means that all of us on this call, chief compliance officers, compliance professionals, outside lawyers, outside consultants, have to do a more documented, robust job if we find ourselves under investigation. So our roles have become much more important, I think. And the work that you need to do needs to be, as I've said several times now, documented and following whatever your policy or protocol is. So those are really the highlights from the Lisa Monaco speech. I submitted to Isabel a white paper I wrote, and she'll distribute that to anyone who might be interested as well. I'm happy to take anyone's questions along those, either today, or if you have further questions, you can email me. And let me just say a few concluding remarks about the Russian invasion of Ukraine and what it means for compliance. First of all, I have long said that corruption leads to crime, and that leads to terrorism. And that's been something we believed in the United States since 9/11. Now, I think we have the example that corruption has led to crime and now has led to a war. And that's because of the corrupt nature of the Russian system. We saw Putin invade the Ukraine, but now we see the corruption endemic in the Russian army has actually hurt the Russian military effort. So it's a different way to look at the impact of corruption. Number two, everyone has been involved in the sanctions, whether you're in the United States or you're outside the United States, your companies have been impacted by those sanctions. And I'm sure you've been working as diligently as you can to try to determine, what does this mean for our company, even if we're a Brazilian company? Do we have business in Russia? Well, now you have to think about, do we have business with people who do business in Russia? You do business in the Middle East? Do you do business in Eastern Europe? Do you do business in Asia? You're an international Brazilian company? You probably do. So you're going to have to start thinking about, where are our products ending up? Because that's going to be the next level of sanctions. So with that, Isabel and Cynthia, I would turn it back over to you all. And if we have any questions, I'm happy to take them. And if you need me to talk more, I'm happy to talk more.
Great. It's very wonderful, very special information, Tom. And I'm sure that many of our attendees here have gone through monitorships. Probably don't want to go through any other monitorship anymore, but they're very interested in the aspect of individual accountability. That is one of the items that Lisa Monaco's emphasized. And also many people here work in global companies. So your comments on how the program should be a global program are extremely interesting. But without further ado, we have a first question here. It comes from João Elec, who's now on the board of many companies. He is definitely a compliance champion. He was the compliance chief officer of Petrobras in the past. And he is, I'm going to just read the question to you. He says, "Good morning, Professor Tom Fox. Always a pleasure to listen your words of wisdom. During the SARS-19 pandemic that many compared to a war, there were a spree of corruption activities. Now that there is a true war with significant implications in many geographies, attempts to corruption activities are booming again. Which are the lessons learned that could be put in place to prevent or fight such activities? Thank you, João.
I think what this war has done is to raise the awareness of many who had not really thought about a war as being something that would come out of corruption or be an adjunct to corruption. And it's elevated the fight, really the international fight against bribery and corruption. In December, the Biden administration released a document which said that it viewed corruption as directly against the national security of the United States. Obviously, this was before the Russian invasion, but now, so we had that from December, and now we have this Russian invasion. But let me maybe answer it in a little bit different way, and this may speak to some work, Isabel, you and your colleagues have done around ESG. This is the first war where not only did ESG play a role, but really public opinion, because in the United States, we had many employees of companies going to their employers and say, get out of Russia now. And they did that publicly. They did that on social media. They band together in groups. And so we had a very large groundswell of employees, customers, shareholders, institutional investors saying, we do not want to be associated with doing business in Russia. One, because the Russian regime has invaded Ukraine, but two, we don't want to be on the wrong side of history. And we don't want that reputational damage. So we've got a lot of moving parts here, and your analogy, if I can say, John, to the COVID-19 SARS war is absolutely spot on. We're moving now from sort of crisis to crisis. We had a medical crisis, then we had a geopolitical crisis. Well, now we have a military crisis. And how you respond as a company is going to be critical. And in the case of the Russian invasion, we had literally employees protesting against their companies, get out of Russia now. So you have to be able to respond, but you have to be prepared to respond as well.
Thanks, Tom. We have another question from actually a colleague of mine at CRA. And her question is more along the lines of cooperation amongst jurisdictions. Have you seen post-Trump administration more cooperation amongst jurisdictions insofar as monitorships are concerned? What we've seen in a lot of the jobs that we do is in a lot of these monitorships, the approach is very US centric. And as more cooperation arose between, European jurisdictions or Brazilian jurisdictions, the monitorships tended to be less US centric. But it's been years since we've worked on a monitorship as a result of just general lack of monitorships occurring with the amount of frequency that they were in the past. What is your view going forward? Should there be an increase in monitorships? Will there be more cooperation, and how so?
So we have not yet seen the US mandate more monitorships, even though we had this policy announcement. And the Department of Justice has said since October, more monitors are coming. We have not had enforcement actions to tell us that. They just keep saying it's coming. So we have to at least concede that they've said that. So, but you're absolutely right, Cynthia. I think there's been an evolution in monitorships from a very US-centric to understanding that there needs to be, if not two monitors, and I know that may be heresy, but there needs to be some sort of blending of the US approach and the approach of the country where the company is headquartered. And the best example I can point you to, and I think what the US has learned most of its lessons from, was from the Volkswagen monitorship. I understand that was not corruption, it was air emissions or other types of crimes, but there was a US monitor and a German monitor. And I think the US government saw the power in that, really cooperation going forward. And that's going to be, it will be some sort of blended model, whether it's two monitors or whether it's one monitor, but someone or some process to take into account the concerns of both the US and the home jurisdiction of the country. That's also, of course, overlaid by the dramatic increase, which started under the Obama administration, but continued under the Trump administration for joint settlements and across multiple jurisdictions. Obviously, the United States and Brazil, United States, Brazil, and England, England, France, and the United States with Airbus, Goldman Sachs. I think it was 6 countries across the globe. So as we continue to have greater cooperation across jurisdictions and in investigations and settlements, I think that the monitorships will follow that as well. So it's an evolving process, but I think there's hope that we will move away from the US-centric approach.
Excellent. You know, Tom, that I like monitorships a lot, and I've been a monitor, and it's one of my greatest loves in this profession. But I like the fact that Lisa Monica's talking about it being more cooperative, more of a possibility, an opportunity to have, to sort of spread the compliance and enforce it in a friendly way. Having said that, the next question comes from, oops, the question disappeared. It was a question from Isabel. Tatiana, as perguntas desapareceram.
I think they've moved it to answered, Belle, but it hasn't been answered.
No, it hasn't been answered, but I know what the question was. So Tatiana is saying that it's now in the chat. Yes, it comes from Sibeli in Portuguese, head of legal department of Voice, and she is thanking you for this opportunity. And she says, considering this amplitude of new concepts of DOJ regarding culture and other matters like D&J and compliance with all of the law, it seems that we are migrating to an ESG environment. Do you think the role of the compliance specialist shall also change? What valuable advice could you give on that? Her name is Sibeli.
Sibeli, thank you for that question. I'm extraordinarily passionate about the following. Compliance needs to, you need to lead your ESG effort, or you need to be very involved in it. And you need to lead it for a couple of different reasons. Number one, almost everything in ESG touches compliance in some way. I'm going to leave the E aside for a moment, but I'll get back to that. So the S and the G, social sustainability, whatever you call the S, that is things that absolutely compliance can oversee, whether it's diversity, inclusion, and equity, whether it's workplace safety, whether it's health and safety, whether it's social justice. All of those things are things exactly within corporate culture. And so I can tie it specifically back to the Lisa Monaco speech. What's your culture around all of those? And how do you assess that? What do you do as a compliance officer? You get tone at the top, you do a risk assessment, you put policies and procedures and a code of conduct in place based upon your risk assessment to manage those risks. That's what you do in an ESG program, except in an ESG program, you call a risk assessment a materiality assessment. But from that materiality assessment, then you put policies and procedures and controls in place. And then you monitor those. And then you continuously improve those. I've just described the 5 basic steps of a compliance program. Of course, there's training, there's ongoing communication, there's discipline, there's incentives, there's third parties and others, but those are really the basic steps. The things you do as a compliance officer are exactly what ESG requires. Now let me move to the G. That's governance. That is exactly what we do in compliance. Corporate governance. Who do you talk to? You talk to the board of directors. What does the board do? They oversee your compliance program. What about data? Data governance. What about policies and procedures? That's governance. All of that is governance. So you're already doing the S and the G. Now let me move to the E. And many compliance officers and lawyers think, well, unless you're an environmental lawyer, you can't do E. Well, that's not correct, because what do you do as a compliance officer? You take information in, you document that information, and then you report that information, whether you report that to the board of directors, whether you report that to regulators should they come knocking, whether you report that internally to management. That's what you do in the E part of ESG. Now, do you need some technical experts to help you define things like carbon capture or climate risk management? Perhaps yes, but those people can report and give the information, but you as the compliance officer, you're already doing that reporting already. So I think the compliance profession is the most uniquely suited in the corporate world to run ESG. And if, back to my remarks on the Russian invasion and how this is really the first war that's impacted ESG, I can think of no better example. Companies have to be aware of ESG. They have to be aware of what the stakeholders in their corporations want them to do. Most importantly, though, is the investor class. Institutional investors, financial investors, large private equity funds, banks, and even insurance companies now are looking at corporate ESG programs. And if you want to raise capital, whether it's through a private investment or listing shares publicly, you're going to have an ESG program. So that's what's going to drive ESG. But I think it's extremely important that you as a compliance officer be involved in that. And if you're a CCO at your company, are you either heading up that ESG program or are you heavily involved? And I think that we all as compliance professionals need to be.
Thanks, Tom. Before I go to the next question, do you think it's possible, and I'm sitting here as a passive listener, I'm not a compliance officer, but isn't it a lot for a compliance officer now to kind of also be managing ESG?
Well, it is an increase, but if you think about it in terms of, 90% of what we're doing really falls within ESG. If you think about it that way, it's not a huge step. I do agree it's going to be some more, but if you think about it in terms of what's the structure of your compliance program, like I said, it's assessing your risk, and then you manage your risk, and you manage your risk through written documents, policies, procedures, and controls. You use the information you get from all three of those in a continuous monitoring, and then move to continuous improvement. That's the same process for ESG. You're just looking at different information. The Department of Justice has already told us in June of 2020 that the compliance function must have access to all data in a corporation, not just compliance data, and that the chief compliance officer is really the person who should head institutional justice and institutional fairness at a corporation. That's directly in the S. That's what S is, fairness and justice. Now, it could be diversity, equity, and inclusion. It could be social justice. It can be workplace safety. It can be all of those things. But that's what the S is. It's fairness and justice. So you already actually have those requirements. And by expanding this out, but thinking about it in terms of how can I use the structure that I have in place for an anti-corruption compliance program for ESG, it gives you a way to think about that and structure your program so that you're not overwhelmed. You're not, oh my God, I've taken over something that is so big, I can't even understand it all right now. You think about it in terms of what's your program for anti-corruption compliance, trade sanction compliance, or even anti-money laundering. It's going to be that same basic format. You assess your risk or the materiality, put policies, procedures, and controls in place, then monitor those controls. The information you get back from those controls moves to helping you continually improve your compliance program. So yes, it can seem like a lot, but if you think about it in terms of your compliance program, perhaps it's not 100 steps, perhaps 5 steps, maybe 10 steps, but it's manageable.
No, thank you. I thought that's a great way to think about it.
Uh,
Less overwhelming.
Right. I liked it also. It was great to hear you say that, Tom. The next question comes from someone who's very dear to me. He is the founder of Azevedo Sette, Azevedo Sette. He says, in fact, I'm afraid that the current war in Ukraine will deeply change the compliance concept existing in the US vis-a-vis European countries. Am I right?
I would say it's going to bring a lot more attention to it. I think the basic concepts of corruption, anti-corruption are well understood in Western Europe, and they're moving across Eastern Europe. But I think the countries in Eastern Europe that are perceived to be more corrupt than those in Western Europe are now understanding the invidiousness of corruption and what it can do to destroy a nation, and in Russia's case, a nation's ability to make war or defend itself. So I think it's going to increase visibility for anti-corruption for the better.
Very good.
Tom, I have a question regarding this increase in accountability by individuals. Have you seen an increase when individuals are involved? There tends to be more litigation. How has that come into play?
You know, that's
addressing these issues.
That's a really interesting question, Cynthia. And let me point you to an academic study that came out. It was pre-pandemic, so I have to say probably 2018. And a gentleman named Kyle Welch from George Washington University looked at, he had access to Navex Global's whistleblower data. Now, this was anonymized, so he didn't know the company. And what he found was, so he's looking at whistleblower reports, which is exactly what you say, individuals reporting. And what he found was companies that had not more whistleblower reports, but more robust whistleblower reporting systems. So they had a system to take in a whistleblower report, but equally important, they listened to the whistleblower and then they did something. They investigated, they communicated with the whistleblower, and they took action. Companies that had a robust whistleblower, whether you call it a whistleblower culture or a whistleblower reporting system, they had dramatic decreases in costs. And in the United States, there's a key word called material. So a decrease in material costs. For US public companies, that was, and the definition of a material decrease is 5%. So US public companies who had a robust whistleblowing system had a decrease in their litigation and regulatory fines and penalties of over 5%. So if you're in the energy business or in the energy space, that could be literally hundreds of millions of dollars by having that. Number one. Number two, if we move to civil litigation only, so say individuals suing a company for discrimination, harassment, or something, not a regulatory action, not a fine and penalty, those costs were reduced 20%. So you had, these were very dramatic numbers because it was the first time someone had looked at the specific issue of whistleblowing, not an overall, whether you have a high quality compliance program, not whether you're part of the world's most ethical company honorees, Ethisphere, something like that. This was specific to those who whistle blew, and companies that took that information internally and acted on it, they had a dramatic lowering of their costs So the clear message was that if you have that system in place and you allow people literally to raise their hand and speak up, if you have a true speak up culture where people are not discriminated against because they raised their hand and spoke up, then you can have a dramatic decrease in both regulatory costs and civil litigation costs.
Tom, this next question comes from me. I've been dying to ask you this because I'm a little concerned when you were commenting on Lisa Monica's speech that this can all be, the result of the investigation can all be discoverable. Not only that, but it can go straight to the DOJ. So we've always had instructions to document it, but it has to be more robust. But on the other hand, I'm almost thinking, well, for instance, will I have to give my notes of the interview to the DOJ? Wouldn't it be better then not to produce the notes, for example, in terms of trying to protect some of the problems that I may have internally?
Okay, yes, sorry, I didn't make that clear. So it's two steps. Number one, you say you report to the Department of Justice. You can do a written report, you can do an oral report. The second step that I mentioned, though, is if the Department of Justice then brings criminal proceedings against an individual who you have done a report on, at that point, your work product becomes discoverable. And it doesn't matter whether there's been a written report or an oral report, because if your report was based on your work product, that is when it becomes discoverable. When you turn over information to the Department of Justice, you do not have to turn over your, when I say your attorney work product, so if you, and we all do, we all have theories, we all look at different things, and then we have a final report. That's the way attorneys work. So that final report, obviously, if you turn it over, the information it's based on is discoverable. So, but that's only in that second part where criminal proceedings are brought and then the defendant asks for your work product.
Excellent. Thank you. Cynthia? Great question.
Tom, in terms of the pandemic, what have we seen? The DOJ, have there been any trends these past 2 years in terms of enforcement? Has the department been quiet? What has it been focusing on these past 2 years?
Well, in terms of the pandemic, what the department is focused on is fraud and corruption during the pandemic. So they have now tasks, a task force for specific pandemic fraud that is usually involved monies or funds or something that the government provided to help companies or individuals through the pandemic. So it's really been on sort of medical fraud issues as opposed to real corruption issues. Corruption is still a part of it, but that's kind of handled under this healthcare fraud in the pandemic task force.
Have we seen investments in combating corruption during the pandemic or no?
By the Department of Justice?
By the SEC, by the DOJ?
In terms of, there was a very big increase in overall fraud fighting capabilities by the Department of Justice when the Biden administration came in, but that's been in a variety of areas, including the healthcare fraud.
Great, thank you, Tom. I think we have time for the 2 questions that are in the Q&A, but we have to be quick because after that we have the book raffle. I will take the one from Marisa, and then Cynthia, you take the one from Cristiano. Marisa Perez is the compliance director of Nissan, and she is in charge of Nissan South America. She's gone through monitorships, and she could be the teacher here, but she's she wants to talk about the Japanese companies that are not so evolved on corporate governance and understanding the role of the C-level on the compliance program. So she says, I do know that there were some companies from Japan that had agreements with the DOJ, but they do not seem to have the education effect that you would like. Do you think that with this new vision on DOJ, they would take into consideration this gap from companies that are not on the side of the world?
So I have worked for one of those, not Japanese companies, but I worked for a non-US company where there was that gap. So I certainly understand that. And the difficulty for a non-US company is if they do business in the United States or somehow fall under US jurisdiction and violate a law, whether it's the FCPA, whether it's anti-competitive, antitrust, et cetera, the Department of Justice is going to bring an action, and they're going to require that company to basically clean itself up. And we've had just a recent example in the United States of a Chinese company called ZTE, which had a very, very difficult time cleaning itself up. So the reality in the kind of modern global economy is that if you're going to do business in a US or a Brazil or a United Kingdom or a France or some other country with a more advanced anti-corruption law, you're going to have to follow that in some way.
Excellent. Thanks, Tom. So the next and last question is from Cristiano Rodriguez. I will relay to you his message. He says, it was a pleasure to listen to your words and ideas. I'll read it to you. In my opinion, it seems we're living a dilemma. The majority of Russians are against the Ukraine's invasion. As COO, guardians of global culture and ESG, how can we help them in their business without supporting Putin's acts of war?
That's going to be very difficult for us to support individual Russians because of the way sanctions are going to be levied. They're going to be levied on Russian companies. And if you're in a Russian company in Russia trying to do business, is going to be very difficult for people in the United States or people in Brazil or other countries who want to provide support to those people who don't support Putin to get through. And at this point, I'm not quite sure how we can do that. Hopefully you have some friends or colleagues from Ukraine you can support and maybe support them. And that's, I know, one of the things I've tried to do. But I know many compliance professionals in Russia. I've talked to them over the years and in ways like we're doing now. And there's just nothing I can do to support them. At this point, we've had delegations of Russian compliance officers come to Texas. So the compliance community is literally a worldwide community, and we're all dedicated to fighting corruption. But until the war ends, I'm not quite sure what, if anything, we can do to support those that are currently inside Russia.
Thanks, Tom.
Thank you.
So before I pass on to Isabel and Azevedo Sette, I really want to thank, Isabel and Tom just for the quality of this webinar. I really think this was the best one we've done so far. Thank you both. Really, thank you. And with that, I'll pass on to Isabel. Thank you.
Thank you, Cynthia, for the very kind remarks. Tom, you're always a champion. Just to remind you that if you didn't get the book this time, you can buy it through Amazon's one of the easiest ways. Is there a discount, Tom?
LexisNexis.com/Fox will give you a 20% discount.
Wonderful. We'll send it to anyone who's interested in that. We will also send the white paper of this conversation today to everyone who's interested, or probably to the whole list. We just don't want to clog your email, but the white paper is really very, very useful, very good. We always love it. Gustavo's saying, that's me, unbelievable. Thank you so much for this opportunity. Okay, so just to end our program, we will have Tom again in June, probably the first week of June. We're not sure yet because there are a few things going on with everyone here, and but hopefully it will be around the 10th of June. And again, the program that is for the male attendees, Tea with Professor Carol Bastry on the date is the 27th of April, and João Elec will be our coordinator, our moderator. In other words, the showman. That will be 5 o'clock. You will also receive the invitation. So with all that, we want to thank you all for attending, and hope to see you again very soon. And definitely we will bring Tom Fox here in person in October. Thank you, Tom. Do you want to close with your remarks?
Thanks again. And I'm greatly hoping that I can be there in person in October to meet and see everyone. But I look forward to our next breakfast roundtable.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you all.
Thanks,
Have a
everyone.
great week. Bye.